Thank you very much, Theo. Good evening, everyone, or good morning. I think we've probably got some people tuning in from the other side of the Atlantic. It just gives me great pleasure. I will be brief, but I just want to say I'm really excited and delighted that we've got such a fine spread of presentations coming. It's I think this is the second installment, isn't it, of the postgraduate conference, and it's a great new institution put together by the proposed by the Centre for Yoga Studies Committee. And I'm going to chair today's session. There's 3 papers and they span the full historical gamut, I think, of yoga practice, really from the earliest period that we know about. So the sort of Shramana period, 4th, 5th century BCE, all the way up to the present day. We go through then to Yogeshwaras in the pretty much first millennium, a bit of second millennium, and then we can all relax with a bit of Shavasana, which is going to take us right up to this present peaceful epoch that we all live in. Well, no, that we don't, that we need Shavasana for. Okay, so everyone's going to talk sort of 15 to 20 minutes, then we should have about 5 minutes for questions afterwards. I'll keep an eye on the Slido, but I'm going to chair the Q&A sessions after each one. So first up is Anja Nikodem. I should say that everyone presenting is either a current or former SOAS postgraduate student, which is great. This evening, I'm not sure about, I think all current or former students. Today we've got Anja, well, first up, Anja Nikodem on Jaina and Ājīvika soteriology, ideas of free will and determinism. So over to you, Anja. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Theo. I'm gonna share my screen. I hope it's gonna work. Yes. Okay, can you see? Okay, I'm gonna compare Jaina and Ājīvika soteriology by referring to ideas of free will and determinism. And I choose that because I think that even though there are a lot of similarities, that by the ideas of free will and determinism, also the differences become understandable. And first, I'm gonna look at definitions of free will and determinism. So free will means that there's a possibility for an agent to choose between at least 2 paths without any strings attached. And free will can be combined with determinism, which then would be soft determinism. If it's not combinable with determinism, then we're talking about hard determinism. And by determinism, I refer to causality, so that every event has a certain effect. And to understand the soteriologies, also the term fatalism is important, which distinguishes itself from determinism as it is determined by a higher power, such as a deity-like figure. Okay, then a few words about the context. As you already said, Jim, it's the Jaina and Ājīvika originating in northern India, 500 to 400 BCE. And that was a time of social transformations, economical, political, and also somehow away from the Brahminical society and the belief system of, or the ideal of the householder and animal sacrifices. So this facilitated the rise of Shramana movements, and 2 of them are the Jaina and Ājīvika, and the founder Mahavira of the Jaina and Makali Goshala most likely spent some time of the mendicant life together, and according to one source, about 6 years. And for that period is characteristic the rise of the idea of karma and rebirth. And to say a few words about that in general, karma is a system of cause and effect, so causal determinism, and it binds the adherent in the cycle of rebirth, samsara. And the cycle of rebirth means suffering, and to come out of the cycle of rebirth in exchange for liberation, all karmic particles have to get loose, and at the same time no forma can be accumulated. And I'm now gonna look at the similarities according to the Jaina and Ājīvika. First, the karma theory of the Jains. And the Acharanga Sutra here states, knowing the misery that results from action, So according to that, all action results in misery, and that is because it might harm other living beings. For that's the ideal of ahimsa, non-violence, and also because the adherent accumulates karma due to all activities. And activities are defined by the Tatvata Sutra as operation of the body, speech, and mind. So the same mental as also physical activities. And non-activity by that is the solution to be out of the cycle of rebirth. And that correlates to the idea of the Ājīvika, who also say, he who correctly understands inactivity as a means of the path to liberation. So also inactivity as a solution to the fruition of karma, and the same as the Jaina thought, activity results in harming other living being, and also the accumulation of karma. Apart from that, to understand the differences from the two traditions, I'm going to look at ideas of free will in the Jaina thought and of hard determinism in the Ājīvika thought. And first, the ideas of free will according to the Jaina. The Tatvata Sutra here states two. One is that there's a differentiation of karma, so good action causes the inflow of beneficial karma, and evil action causes the inflow of harmful karma. And apart from that, it depends if an action is done by with passions or without passion, because according to Jaina thought, the karma sticks to the soul, and the soul becomes more sticky if an action is done with passion, or if the soul is passionate, and passions are desire or hatred, for example. So there's also already a differentiation that the mendicant can choose between different forms of action. And the second form of free will is that austerities or ascetic practices. Austerities were of karma as well as inhibiting it. So apart from austerities which correlate to non-activity, usually ending in voluntary suicide, also it is believed, or it was believed, that the austerity or the suffering from the austerities does hasten the process of fruition of karma. And even so, there's a mix of causal determinism because of the karma theory, but also a mendicant can decide how fast or can somehow influence the time of liberation. And even though in the Ājīvika thought, there are also ideas about asceticism, there's an important difference towards the Jaina thought. Here the first source says, which is a Buddhist source, there's no such thing as saying, by this austerity of holy life, I have to move. I will bring my unripened karma to fruition, or I will gradually make this ripened karma go away. Both the fool and the wise, having transmigrated, having gone through the cycle of rebirths, will put an end to unhappiness. So here it is clearly stated that, or it is interpreted here that even though asceticism is important to not accumulate more karma, it is not possible to hasten the process. And that again is related to one key aspect of Ājīvika soteriology, that everything is predestined. This is in the second source here I'm quoting. The first sentence says, neither pleasure nor pain, neither what is productive nor what is counterproductive is done by the agent himself or by something else. So everything is driven by an external force. And the last sentence says, all this is related to destiny. So there's no room for free will, and the mendicant cannot influence the way of events, or the soul has to go a certain event in samsara. And for me, the main part about the destiny or the predestined ideas in Ājīvika is that there's a given time period for soul in samsara, which correlate to 8,400,000 aeons. That is the last quotation on this page, because this makes it impossible for anybody to take a decision. That totally negates the idea of free will, because whenever there are no because there's no way of influencing the time of liberation, because the time of liberation is after a certain finite time. So there's no way of choosing for a mendicant. And this given time period does not exist in Jaina thought. And however, there are similar fatalistic elements in Jaina, in the Jaina path of liberation, like souls which are worthy of liberation and souls which are unworthy of liberation, which contradict the idea of free will, or at its best an illusion of free will. But I think here it's important, a part of what also is argued by Padmanabh Jaini and Piotr Balcerowicz, that it is important to see the cultural context, that most likely that this fatalistic idea, which denies the idea of free will, is an appropriation of Ājīvika thought. And for that, I think that even though the two paths of liberation are very closely intertwined, by looking at the ideas of free will and determinism, it is possible to compare them and to show the differences if also the cultural context is taken under consideration. Yeah. And I'm seeing I was faster than I expected. The last slide are already the sources, and I put up all of the secondary sources I used here, mainly if anybody wants to have a look of other people who are writing about free will and determinism. And the most recent one are Piotr Balcerowicz and Bronkhorst and Paul Dundas, and also Padmanabh Jaini was writing about that idea. Okay, then thanks a lot. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Anja. Keeping us well on time as well. Can you maybe stop this? Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
See you.
Let's stop it. Okay.
Well, I've got a couple of questions really. The first, the sources. So, I mean, presumably there's a bit of a disparity between what we know about the Jains and what we know about the Ājīvikas. Yes. I just wondered if you could say a bit more, because you didn't introduce your Ājīvika. Obviously, you didn't have much time, but say a bit more about the Ājīvika sources. Is it mostly? I think one quote was from a Buddhist sutra, wasn't it? So saying what they do, a bit of Pali Canon. But yeah, you just say it. And do you think that there's enough within those sources to be sure of what they thought?
First of all, we don't have any primary sources which directly originate from the Ājīvika. They are from Buddhist or Jaina describing the Ājīvika. And of course, that can mean a distortion. I think we can believe it to a certain amount if the sources agree. If the sources do not agree, then I think we can't. But Paul Dundas, for example, argues that most likely the fatalistic idea is a negative description of Buddhist and Jaina sources about the Ājīvika. So there are people who argue in another direction, yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then, so if they were so fatalistic and they didn't believe that any of these practices were worth doing, what were they doing? Because we know they were doing things, don't they? Some of the sources do describe what they were up to, at least what they looked like and so forth. Or do you think that they were I mean, could they have been sort of forerunners of the Charavakas, who are the ultimate straw men who don't believe that anything is worth doing, and eat, drink, and be merry philosophy? What did this fatalism, what impact did it have on their actual practice, do you think?
It's actually a good question. I think in the end they were doing what they were supposed to do. I mean, that's what the sources say. There's a given thing, and at the end there's asceticism towards a voluntary suicide. And I think it's more. I think it's a thing we cannot really know what they were doing, because we cannot ask them how it would impact anybody who understands the theory behind their own lives, that we don't have a free choice.
Presumably they were doing something that perhaps the others felt threatened, maybe is too strong a word, but that they had to respond to, and they were seen as rivals in some way to the Buddhists and the Jainas. But okay.
And I think there are also ideas that it can't really, that's one reason why they don't exist anymore, because it's too strong, the idea of fatalism. So this is also quite interesting, but it's the reason why I looked into it further, because somehow this fatalistic ideas really fascinated me to look into it. What does it mean not to have a choice if everything is predestined?
Great, thank you. Well, we don't actually have any questions in the Slido yet. I don't know if anyone's put it in. Have we got any hands up? I can't see any hands up. In which case, I mean, maybe we can press on, and if someone does have a question for Anja, we can bring it back in at the end. I will keep an eye on the Slido. And next up is, I think, Sabbi, isn't it? Sabbi Lall.
I believe so, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly, Sabbi.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll share my screen. And can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. So hello, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to start by thanking, first of all, Theo for all her organization, Jim for chairing, and the Center for Yoga Studies for hosting this. So today I'm going to talk about work from my master's dissertation, which examined the Sanskrit terms Yogeshvara and Yogishvara, shown here in Devanagari. And my interest in these terms was first piqued by a reading of the Hatha Pradipika, sometimes called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. This is a key text in the Hatha Yoga corpus that has been dated to around the year 1400 of the Common Era. It contains a series of progressive psychophysical practices, as described in chapter 1 of the text itself: posture, breath retention, the wonderful technique called mudra, and then concentration on the inner sound is the sequence of practice in Hatha. The fourth chapter of the text is called Samadhi, and in verse 81 of this chapter, the author points out, and this is Akka's translation, that unequaled, unutterable bliss grows in the hearts of good yogis experiencing Samadhi by concentrating on nada, so inner sound. Only a great guru knows it. And what struck me about this was the Sanskrit term being used in this verse, which is Yogishvara. Akkas translates this as good yogi, and this is a little muted. So this is one of the pinnacles of practice coming towards the end of the text. And Yogishvara is sometimes translated instead as Lord of Yogis. Here, the Hatha Pradipika is suggesting that beings focused on nada, inner sound, are Yogishvaras. And since this is a Sanskrit plural, that means there are more than two of these lords of yogis. So I'm not the first person to be intrigued by this term. David Gordon White discusses the term in his book, Sinister Yogis. Indeed, when I mention this term, people often have interesting ideas about it from their own sources, and I'd love to hear yours in the question and answer section, or please reach out to me after the talk. One reason that this term is so intriguing is that it has broad reach across history. Skip back several centuries from the Hatha Pradipika, and we see a very similar term being used in another major text in the history of yoga, the Bhagavad Gita. So in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 11, just before the deity Krishna reveals his divine form, a portrayal of which is seen on the right, the protagonist Arjuna appeals to Krishna as Yogeshvara, but the term is also found in modernity. So in 2017, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, shown here, unveiled a monumental bust of the deity Shiva called Adiyogi, first yogi. And in front of this is a consecrated lingam, an iconic representation of Shiva called Yogeshvara, one of the terms we're interested in. In his speech, Modi pointed to the colossal presence of the statue and the lingam and connected them to a discussion of yoga in modernity. So this isn't a term that I'm dusting off from the back of the Sanskrit closet. It's present in some of the earliest texts, and it's indeed colossally present today. So from here on in, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the texts that I examined in my master's dissertation. I'm going to discuss the meaning of Yogeshvara and Yogeshvara. So I'm going to treat them together. One of my original theories was that, and hypotheses was that they would be used distinctly, and it's quite difficult to prove that that's the case, although it may be the case. And then I'll discuss practitioners as Yogeshvaras in the Hatha Yoga corpus specifically, and that is texts that emerge from the 11th or 12th century onward that deal with or are related to Hatha Yoga. First, the texts. So I'm going to give you, I looked at a really broad overview of Sanskrit text groups across time. So from left to right on this slide, you're seeing time given in centuries after the beginning of the Common Era. And each bar represents one of the texts that I looked at. So I went really broad, not deep, and just gathered every occurrence of these and some related terms in these texts. And this approach comes with limitations, but it removes the idea that I would focus subjectively on my favorite text and get a broad overview of its usage. And at this point, I'd like to extend my very great awe and deep gratitude to projects like the Skanda Purana project, the Hatha Yoga project, the scholars that worked on the critical edition of the Mahabharata. And there are many occurrences of these terms in the Mahabharata, mostly related to Shiva or Vishnu or Krishna. And that would be they'd be the basis of a paper on their own. And indeed, I'd like to thank the many brilliant scholars who've taken on these texts. Their work provides some access to the practices, philosophies, and beliefs present in what are very difficult texts. So what do Yogeshvara and Yogeshvara mean if we extract them from these texts and look at the Sanskrit? So they're both Sanskrit compounds, meaning that we can break them down. And they can be broken down into two words, yoga or yogis, and Ishvara. So Ishvara comes from the verbal root, Sanskrit verbal root ish, to rule, command, to own. And the scholar Jan Gonda has written out about this term and points out that Ishvara occurs 6 times in the Atharva Veda Samhita, and has argued that the verbal idea expressed by this root may be described as possessing and displaying extraordinary power and the ability to achieve uncommon performances and sovereignty. But an Ishvara can also be human. So it could be the human master of a house or the human master of a practice, a really good yogi. So Ishvara also takes on technical terms in certain traditions. And so it can mean a realm. In the Tantras, it takes on that idea. And I would be very remiss if I didn't mention the Purusha Vishesha of Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, the special Purusha as he describes it. So amongst other things, and this is just a very small subset of the meanings that yoga and yogis can take on, is the idea of yoga as we think of it, a state, a practice, yogis that practice this practice, but they can also be magicians or have magical powers. Now, I've already mentioned that the terms used in the Bhagavad Gita, now the implications of this are huge because this text comes to us with a rich commentarial tradition from India itself. And so we can see how eminent scholars have viewed Yogeshvara as it appears in chapter 11, verse 4 of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, understanding the commentaries on this verse alone would be a thesis. And briefly, and from my explorations relatively preliminarily, Yogeshvara is associated with Ishvara. So here we see the commentary attributed to Shankara, and he uses the term Shvamin, meaning proprietor, master, lord, and this is evoked in more than one commentary. And he also raises the terms yogins and yoga, whatever these terms meant to him. In his commentary on 11.4, Ramanuja cites the 6 attributes, and I've highlighted the sentence in red, of a divine Ishvara. So that is knowledge, strength, sovereignty, valor, power, and splendor. Other commentators, here Madhusudana, link this term to anamadi or siddhis. So these are the 8 powers, magical powers that can arise from yoga, the power to become very small, etc. In short, the interpretation of Yogeshvara is not necessarily uniform. It's based on the beholder's perspective. What we can say is that these definitions of yoga aren't citing the definitions of yoga that the Bhagavad Gita is famous for, at least not overtly, but they are citing a sense of power, perhaps magical power, and perhaps sovereignty. So this is a divine Yogeshvara. What about human Yogeshvaras or Yogeshvaras? Do they even exist? And I have time today to give you one example. There are others, and that's from the Skanda Purana. So in the Skanda Purana, a text that probably had come together by the 8th century of the Common Era, we hear the story of Brahmins who are cursed to a low birth. It's their fault that this happens, but it's kind of a harsh punishment. And we see their journey over multiple lifetimes towards liberation. In their final rebirth before liberation, these Brahmins practice yoga and recite the Vedas. So we know that they're practicing yoga, and they're called Yogeshvaras. This suggests that the Yogeshvara is a high state that precedes liberation through yogic death, at least for these particular Brahmins. Now I'm going to jump forward in time. I expected that if I would find human Yogeshvaras anywhere, it would be in the Hatha Yoga corpus. After all, we started with a keystone text in this corpus, the Hatha Pradipika, but I was a little surprised. So just for orientation, Hatha Yoga is a Sanskrit term used in Indian texts from approximately the 12th century CE onwards to denote a type of yoga in which physical practices predominate. Now, the methods of Hatha Yoga, this quote from Jim goes on to say, are the source of much of the yoga practiced around the world today. But when I looked at a number of different Hatha Yoga texts, and they're labeled in this table, and they're roughly ordered by the time when we think that they were written, or where scholars have suggested they were written. And I've given you check marks wherever I find the term Yogeshvara or Yogeshvara. We find it from the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, so this is the last 4 rows, pretty present, so present in the corpus. But when we look earlier, the situation is much more murky. So I've included the Vivekamatanda. It's in grey because I'm not sure of the version that I have, but I wanted to be transparent and say that I think that I see the term Yogeshvara in here. If we go really early to the Amarauga, we see the term Yogeshvara, but it's qualified with Sama. So what this suggests is that the practitioner is not actually a Yogeshvara, but they're equal to a Yogeshvara or similar. So what terms are these texts, especially the early ones, using to describe a really good yogi? Well, Mahayogi comes up a few times, but so does a term that's translated very similarly to Yogeshvara, and that term is Yogindra. And so now we see in red check marks all the instances of Yogindra. So there's one check mark, but it can occur multiple times in these texts. And you'll see that this term, often translated as master of yoga, has broad reach in the corpus over time. Now, this is a big picture overview. There's a story, in fact, multiple stories behind every check mark and every absence of a check mark. And an absence of a check mark doesn't mean it isn't present. It just means I didn't find it. So where does the term Yogindra come from? Well, the most simple, the most parsimonious explanation would be that it comes into the corpus with the Amrita Siddhi. This early text has been suggested very convincingly by James Mallinson to have emerged in a Vajrayana Buddhist milieu. And the presence of Yogindra in the Amrita Siddhi and the broad traction of this term in the Hatha Yoga corpus I believe points to the influence of both the Amrita Siddhi and its specific vocabulary. Indeed, Yogendra is barely present in the Mahabharata, one of the major sources of thought in what we might call Hinduism. Perhaps what's not present in the Mahabharata might be found elsewhere. The term Yogendra is also a name for the sage Yajnavalkya, and he's a yogi. So it's possible that that might be the source of the term Yogendra in these texts, but I'm not so sure because he's not always mentioned. He is mentioned in the Yoga Yajnavalkya as a Yogendra, of course. Now, the verses that call the yogi Yogendra are diverse. So it's not one verse that's traveling through the corpus. They tend to describe power. They aren't linked necessarily to a specific practice. So Yogendra is present in early texts, but does that really mean that Yogeshvara is absent? So to answer this question, let's take a closer look at the Amanaska. So the Amanaska is a text that focuses on Laya and Raja Yoga rather than Hatha Yoga. But Jason Birch's thesis provides a robust analysis that I found insightful for my research. So Yogendra is present in the majority of the Amanaska manuscripts that Jason Birch examined while producing a critical edition of the text. He looked at many manuscript witnesses, over 70, 32 in full, and produced a single annotated critical edition based on all of the slightly varying handwritten versions of the Amanaska that he had in hand. The translation of the critical edition for verse 63 says, by means of absorption for 10 nights, the best of yogins, Yogendra, who is established in himself, sees any number of very secret and greatly strange things. Now, the critical edition of this verse contains the term Yogendra, but do all of the manuscripts that underlie this verse? The answer is no. So when we look in the footnote, Jason highlights 4 manuscripts where this verse varies, and those manuscripts are using the term Yogeshvara. So for this text, it's very difficult to build a single clean lineage of Amanaska manuscripts that capture all the textual changes over time and go back to a single common ancestor, you might call it. But 3 of these variant manuscripts using the term Yogeshvara are North Indian and likely reflect early versions of the text. So the term Yogeshvara was present in a version of the Amanaska that sits close to the original, but somehow it disappeared. So is Yogeshvara present in other manuscripts that underlie the Hatha Yoga text? And the answer is yes. Sometimes the term Yogeshvara appears in a small number of manuscripts, and I believe it to be a typo, a copying error, as the handwritten copies were made. Sometimes it seems like a major change. So in some manuscripts of the Yoga Theravali use Yogeshvara in a particular verse. Other manuscripts discuss absorption in the feet of Vishnu. So there's a very big difference. Whether it's a typo or a big change, I propose and think that the term Yogeshvara was present in a small minority of manuscripts of early texts in the corpus, but it was kind of flying under the radar until the Hatha Pradipika brought the term to the surface. And I think this is interesting because the Hatha Pradipika is a compilation, and scholars have tracked the source of many of the verses of the Hatha Pradipika, but some remain unassigned. We don't know what the source was. And it's possible that this, and one of those verses I should say, is the verse I read you at the beginning that contains the term Yogeshvara. So it's possible that this verse was picked up from one of the variant verses that were kind of flying under the radar. Now I'm wildly speculating, but that would indicate which sources the author of the Hatha Pradipika had access to or chose to include. So what can I say in the end about Yogeshvara and Yogeshvara? I think we can see how important the influence of the Amrita Siddhi and its vocabulary were. And with the Hatha Pradipika, we see that Yogeshvaras are associated with the pinnacle of practice. So Yogendra is found in the Hatha Pradipika too. It's just associated with earlier stages of practice. Why does the term Yogeshvara emerge in chapter 4 of this text? So James Mallinson, I'm quoting you a lot, has done some interesting work on yogi rajas. So king yogis linked to the monastery at Kadri. that indicate that yogic leaders in this period acquired a sort of sovereignty. One speculative hypothesis would be that Yogeshvara captures this sense of ruling, of kingship and sovereignty associated with the leaders of yoga in this period. So after the Hatha Pradipika, we start to see specific people and sages now being called Yogeshvara. The author of the Hatha Ratnavali and the teacher and sage Garanda in the Garanda Samhita are clearly labeled, one as a Yogeshvara, one as Yogeshvaras in these texts. And so while I feel my initial foray yields more questions than answers about the terms Yogeshvara and Yogeshvara, I am really interested in what can ultimately be gleaned, the way that texts evolve over time, and the insight this provides into the choices that human commentators make on texts, and the choices and sometimes errors that copiers and editors make in relation to spiritual texts. So I would like to end by thanking people who shared sources with me, and that includes Jason Birch and James Mallinson and Adriana Munoz. And I'd really like to thank Shaman Hatley and Seth Powell. So if I said anything silly, it has nothing to do with these people, but without them, I would not be sitting here. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sabbi. That was great, very rich presentation. My main question that I wanted to ask you addressed at the end about the Raja yogis, but I was wondering, have you seen the two terms sort of juxtaposed, the Yogeshvara or Yogeshvara and the Raja yogi within the text? Do they come together? I can't recall whether they do or not. I mean,
I know I haven't seen it yet, but as you can see, I haven't looked at the Yoga Chintamani. I haven't looked at, I could look at a lot more kind of more recent texts, the Yoga Pradipika, there's a bunch of texts missing from that table, I'd say. You do see Yogindra and Yogeshvara come up in interesting ways in other corpuses of texts. So I didn't get into this, but sages are very often called Yogindra and Yogeshvara. Sanakamara is a very notable example, as is Yajnavalkya. And you see that in some texts, Sanakamara is called a Yogindra when he's disrespecting Shiva. So it has like a connotation of someone who's a little arrogant in that context. But he's often also called Yogeshvara when he's being lauded as the leader of all the Yogeshvaras, all the sages of yoga.
Great. Well, we might be able to supply you with a lot more material as well now that we've collated nearly 200 manuscripts of the Hatha Pradipika. We can look at all the different variants of Yogeshvara, Yogindra. Can make your tables, they might get out of control. Anyway, we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to move on to those. And the top of the questions is Pamela Warner. So if we could go on to her, please.
Pamela, please.
I can't see Pamela in the list. Or
Oh, no?
got a hand up. Ah, that's why. No, she's not under her own name. There we go.
Okay.
Well done, Pamela.
I couldn't change my name in the Zoom, so I'm sorry about that. Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, I don't know, and so it's really a question coming from ignorance, if the Ishvara and Indra references have anything to do with the Vedic gods, and how does it translate from being associated with a specific deity to becoming a much more generic term that can be used for anyone of mastery or power? Thank you.
It's a very, very good question. I wondered that myself, whether Yogindra was actually related to Indra as a kind of sidekick of after the Vedas. Yeah, I'm not sure if they relate directly to the Vedas. You don't, as far as I know, don't see these terms in the Vedas or the Upanishads, the Yogeshvara and Yogeshvara terms. In the Mahabharata, they're largely restricted to sages and gods. So there's some change happening between the Bhagavad Gita and the Hatha Yoga corpus. And I think that's probably in the Puranas. So you see many, many instances of ordinary practitioners being called Yogeshvaras in that period. And so there's a lot of flux, I think, happening in that period between the epics and the Hatha Yoga corpus. It's a really good question. And I wish I could give you, I had hoped that my dissertation would have a definitive answer to just that question. So thanks for the question.
Thanks. Okay, we've got a couple more. If we're quick, we should be able to get them both in. First off, Ruth Westerby, please.
Ruth, hi.
Hi, thanks very much for both your papers, Anja and Sabbi. They were excellent. Many years ago, I wrote my MA thesis on Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra. So I was wondering, and I didn't use any of the material that you have been looking at all. It kind of wasn't as available as it is now, perhaps. So my thesis argument was something around like the actual yogins surpass the powers that are associated with Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra. So I wondered if you'd done any sort of comparison with that concept. Thank you.
Yeah, I looked at the concept in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So I'd be interested to hear, actually, to read your dissertation on how this is surpassed. That sounds really interesting. So to me, I think the key things that come out about the Ishvara in yoga, and the reason I looked at it is this is one Ishvara that's definitely related to yoga philosophy as we think of it, is the idea that Ishvara in the Shastra has omniscience and omnipresence, so great knowledge, and presence. So I think in other texts you do see those attributes come out. So I did look at the Pashupata Sutra, and the commentary on that uses the term Yogeshvara. And in that, you really see yogis doing what you're saying. They ascend through their practice of yoga meditation and arrive at a level that's similar to Shiva. And there they're really described as having two of the attributes of Patanjali's Ishvara, omniscience, and all knowledge, all presence, all knowing. Yeah, but I'd be really interested in the point that you made about surpassing Ishvara. Yeah.
Thanks, Sabbi. And then the last question, if we could go to Weston Harris, please.
Hello, thank you, Sabbi. That was a fascinating talk. You mentioned that this was a topic of your master's thesis, so I'm not sure how much it informs your current inquiries and research, but I wonder, you mentioned the importance of the Amrita Siddhi. I wonder how much you may have looked into other Buddhist literature, particularly like narrative works and Tibetan works. For example, the 12th or 13th century author Chogyam Wangchuk calls Virupa a Naljor Wangchuk, which can mean either Yogishwara or Yogeshwara. It's unclear. In like a 12th, 13th century hagiography, it's actually in the title of a Virupa hagiography. And if my memory serves me, there's a number of other Tibetan narrative texts that use the word Naljor Wangchuk pretty liberally, and it seems to have a meaning about powers, like it's interchangeable with Tutup Wangchuk, which usually means like Lord of Powers. So anyways, I'm curious if you've looked into other Buddhist literature.
I haven't, and I was very curious to and you just answered the question, I think, better than I could have with those examples. I'd be really interested in talking to you afterwards. So this is the thing, that there's something about the Amrita Siddhi that's bringing this idea in of Yogindras, and so I think the Buddhist Tantras are a rich source to look at next. And someone's also pointed me towards the Dharma Shastras, so it'll be interesting to see what they have to say. Very different set of texts. But thank you for bringing that up.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sabbi. That's excellent. We're going to move on to the third and final talk now, which is, I'm looking at mine, of course, it's Erica Morton McGill. If we could go to Erica, please, who's going to talk to us about Shavasana.
Hi there, hello, and of course, thank you to Jim and Theo and the Center of Yoga Studies for hosting this conference and for the opportunity to participate, as well as I want to express my appreciation for my colleagues who've presented tonight and will be presenting on Wednesday. I'm a master's candidate at SOAS, currently working on my dissertation in which I explore the history, evolution, and current practice of Shavasana, corpse pose. I'm still in the infant stages of research, so I'm here sharing today in the hopes that the questions I raise spark curiosity and maybe your input and feedback as well. I'm a scholar, but also a yoga practitioner, having practiced Ashtanga for a decade and a half. And the Ashtanga lineage holder, Sharat Joyce, at the close of every led practice commands his students, you take rest, or sometimes when there isn't time, you go home, you take rest. We, his students, have just completed 90 minutes of dynamic, physically demanding yoga postures, and it's time to lie supine and motionless. I'm curious how this practice, whether it's called Shavasana or rest, and I'll detail some differences and similarities between the two in a later part of this paper, came to be a pan-yogic phenomenon, practiced in all manner of contemporary classes, from lineage-based teachings to post-lineage fusion, dynamic and restorative ones. So my research question is really three-pronged. Is Shavasana the thread that ties together all modern postural yoga practices? If so, why is this the case? What purpose does it serve? And what does this teach us about contemporary practice, about culture, modernity, medicine, politics, and art? My methodology is also threefold. Primary and secondary textual sources highlight the evolution of Shavasana, rest, and relaxation over time. I've conducted ethnographic research and interviews which elucidate the current practice. And I'm undertaking a case study that situates yogic rest in the political present. For the sake of time today, you'll get little teasers of each. So possible precursors to Shavasana include hagiographies of Taoist adepts who attempted to reach immortality by going through a simulated death. The Tao Te Ching commentary of the Celestial Masters says, quote, when a Taoist's practices are complete, the spirits of the Tao call that person to return. Departing the world through a simulated death, the person passes through great darkness to be born again and not perish. The Patanjali Yoga Shastra, it names 13 asana for meditation, though none are described in detail in the text itself. One of the poses given is palanka or paryanka, couch posture. The description in Shankara's later commentary is described as a supine posture with arms outstretched to the knees. Notably, the Jain text, the Yoga Shastra of Hemachandra, affirms Shankara's description of palanka, saying that for followers of Patanjali, the couch pose is resting with the arms extended to knees. Patanjali advocates a total cessation of effort in the practice of asana. So perhaps this couch pose resembles what we understand today as Shavasana. It's noteworthy that in the early Buddhist canon, palanka posture is taken, the body is made straight, and meditative practice begins. It is, as Ruth McNeil, who I think is here today, has demonstrated in her MA dissertation, a soteriology of uprightness, which is in contrast to this supine position of Shavasana that I'm speaking of. I then just mentioned Hemachandra's medieval Yoga Shastra, which in addition to confirming palanka as practiced by Patanjali followers, describes Kayot Sarga, casting off of the body pose, as, quote, the position in which one is indifferent towards the body and in which one is either seated or standing with both the arms hanging down. The text goes on, control of the body amounts to controlling one's movements while lying, sitting, rejecting, receiving, walking about, and standing still. This will, quote, bring up, protect, and purify the body. Lastly, the tantric tradition also has a record of Shavasana, which is practicing while seated on a corpse. Each goddess, in some instances, has their own corpse seat. So for example, Kali pictured here is Shavasana. She's seated on a corpse, practicing on a corpse. Jim, I hope this is all correct. Within the Hatha corpus, Shavasana is taught for the first time in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, therein described as one of the samketas or secret methods for dissolving the mind into the absolute, Laya Yoga. The Hatha Pradipika refashions Shavasana as a posture corpse pose. It moreover assigns therapeutic benefit, affirming lying on the back on the ground like a corpse is Shavasana. It removes fatigue and gives rest to the mind. From this time onward, Hatha texts replicate this basic template, sometimes adding flourishes, as you can see from the sampling on the screen. The goal of the asana appears to be primarily therapeutic rather than soteriological. When we arrive to the 19th century, rest is a preeminent concern of both the West and of modernizing India, as it was a prime antidote for the rising epidemic of exhaustion. So throughout medical history, exhaustion has been correlated with myriad diagnoses, including melancholia, acedia, nervousness, neurasthenia, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, and burnout. But there's nothing really natural about these groupings of diverse symptoms into specific disease categories. So they're subject to change and are, rather than simply biological phenomena alone, containers to express situated fears about social transformation, which is to say, exhaustion is an epidemic of signification. Manuals and guides to fight exhaustion most frequently prescribe rest and relaxation as the cure. Edmund Jacobson, an influential figure in the early history of relaxation, writes, "The best remedy we know up to date for this overly intensive living is cultivating relaxation." Writing a half-century later, Marco Vassi penned a small practice manual that perfectly expressed the concerns of his era. He poetically postulates, "We've been shaped by the single paradigm of verticality. We need to dismantle all our unnecessary vertical structures, our hierarchies, competitions, skyscrapers, thrones, missiles. We're exhausted from maintaining that upright stance, and it's time that we lie down." One of the relaxation remedies that arose in response to the epidemic of exhaustion is yogic rest, a practice of lying down. Genevieve Stebbins was an American student of François Delsarte, who was developing her system at a time when physical culture was the domain of men. In Stebbins' program designed for women's wellness, she branded relaxation as a vital principle, and in 1893 wrote, "Relaxation does not mean acting in a relaxed, lazy manner. It means rest after effort, perfect rest after perfect effort." As Elliot Goldberg has pointed out, modern yoga guru Yogendra nearly directly quotes from Stebbins in his 1928 book, Yoga Asanas Simplified. He writes, "Relaxation does not mean lying in a lazy manner or doing nothing. It means that the more perfect the effort, the more perfect is the relaxation." Tirumalai Krishnamacharya is often called the grandfather of modern yoga, and in his early 20th century publication, Yoga Makaranda, he says that rest should be practiced for at least 15 minutes to avoid disease after asana practice. He also notes that lying flat on the back is referred to in other traditions as shavasana. I'm not going to read out this slide here. If you'd like to see it, please send me an email. As has been well documented by Goldberg, Mark Singleton, and others, Yogendra Krishnamacharya and their contemporaries like Vishnu Devananda, Kuvalayananda, and K.V. Iyer imported relaxation techniques and scientific outlooks to subvert colonial powers and formulate yoga as an act of resistance, which they then elaborated upon and packaged as authentic Indian religion. In this religion, the body becomes the site of worship, and according to Singleton, proprioceptive relaxation is, quote, its principal form of prayer. In this view, rest is a somatic soteriology in which relaxing fully and with awareness allows for spiritual growth and salvation. It's perhaps not a surprise then that B.K.S. Iyengar, despite being a student of Krishnamacharya, calls Shavasana, quote, the best antidote for the stresses of modern civilization. In his 2013 publication, Light on Pranayama, he waxes about Shavasana for 22 pages, devoting more ink to it than any other pose. He imbibes it with a mystical metaphysics, noting that after Shavasana, the practitioner is born anew or emancipated. His soul sings the word of Vedic scholar Shankaracharya. The most contemporary text I'll visit is a 2022 publication, Pause, Rest, Be, in which yoga teacher and activist Octavia Rahim says that for so long, I've relied on the trinity of hard work, grit, and relentlessness. It has left me weary and tired. As a salve, she prescribes Shavasana, the pose to which her book is dedicated. I'll return to this activist stance now as I discuss my preliminary ethnographic findings. So I spent a total of 5 weeks between 3 East London yoga communities attending 21 unique types of yoga classes, including Yoga Nidra, Jiva Mukti, Restorative, Yin, Kundalini, Feldenkrais, and hybrid classes like yoga and Pilates. I also spoke to 14 teachers and students in semi-structured interviews, emails, and conversations. As for positionality, I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology, which gives me a foundation in cultural studies. And I've been practicing Mysore, as I mentioned, as sometimes also called Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, for 15 years. This background gives me an embodied and trained experience of modern yoga, its rituals, sounds, and gestures, as well as its cognitive components, Sanskrit terminology, English pose names, familiarity with verbal and mental cues. So even though I attended a variety of class brands, lineages, and styles, I had the body notes, to use a phrase from Jonathan Skinner, to experience each class or practice from both an Edic and emic perspective. I aimed to be an observing participant, again, following Skinner as opposed to anthropology's orthodox participant observer, based on the premise that yoga is a lived metaphysic, quote, and is thus best experienced from the inside. So of the more than 36 total classes I participated in, there were 3 in which neither Shavasana nor rest was practiced, of which 2 made no suggestions that they were yoga classes at all. They were simply fitness classes held at the yoga studio. So in yoga classes in which rest or Shavasana is offered, sometimes instruction is given on how to practice the pose and take the shape. Other times there's an assumption that people know the pose and the teacher simply instructs, take Shavasana or take rest. It's occasionally practiced in between poses and throughout class, as well as or instead of at the end. Sometimes suggestions for props or alternate leg and arm arrangements are offered, and other times not. What I've found in my interviews and conversation is that the terms rest and Shavasana are generally used interchangeably. The exception to their interchangeability is amongst Mysore practitioners who note that in recent years, what was once called Shavasana is now simply rest, because Sharat Joyce says that Shavasana is a very advanced pose in which the body goes still, as in rigor mortis, still and stiff, and the heart stops. I haven't yet found any textual basis for this, so if anyone has any leads, please do send them my way. And this brings me to the idea that there's rest, an English word, and then there's Shavasana, which means remains Sanskritized. On this slide are some of the descriptors given for rest and Shavasana. As you can see, both terms are imbibed with lots of signification and meaning. And there's more words that were used, synonyms and descriptors. So I propose that rest connotes a physiological experience that is healing or regulating, to use terms from my informants, for the nervous system. So one of my informants says, it's about resting and allowing the body to realign the nervous system. Another says, we bring down the hypervigilance to feel safe and find a sense of awe and belonging. Meanwhile, Shavasana is more of a metaphor than rest, imbibed with spiritual beliefs, faith, poetry, and New Age aspirations. Perhaps its usage represents a desire to re-enchant the everydayness of our lives. Folks said, rest is a little death. It's in that final moment before you fall asleep that you're entirely alone and honest and you die a little bit. Another informant said, it's like every part of the practice. Oops, sorry, my PDF viewer inserted itself there. I can't read that one. It's like every part of the practice feels intentional and ritualistic. So for me, Shavasana is a bridge between that one thing being practiced and the next. Another informant infused Buddhism into it. Pema Chodron's always talking about this. The way we treat ourselves becomes how we treat others. Everybody wants more and more and more, but you can see that that's what's destroyed us. We're not listening, and that's why Shavasana is important. So it really becomes, it takes on a whole lot of meanings. It isn't just about lying down flat and relieving fatigue. It carries a lot of metaphors and significance. Both rest and Shavasana express a desire, or seem to express a desire, to oppose oppressing socio-cultural factors of modernity. One is medical, the other is quasi-religious, but both have a sort of zeal to them. So again, we have these very poetic takes and really activist stances. I'm going to read this one right here. Taking those 10 minutes after class then becomes a way of practicing taking rest and taking what you need for yourself throughout the rest of your day, in your relationships, and in my mindset and my attitude. Another informant said, why is rest important? Why is honoring your body important? Why is consent important? All of these things are linked. Let's listen to women and think about women's bodies and cycles and birth and motherhood, because rest is hardly ever discussed in that context. This feels aligned with the cultural zeitgeist. So here I have a quote from Otessa Moshfegh's 2018 publication, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, in which the protagonist decides to sleep for a prescription drug-induced year of recuperation. And to the right, an Instagram post that went viral this past month. So there's this idea that resting is rejuvenating, is a way to take a stance. We sort of lie down to stand up for ourselves and our needs. Again, this feminist stance in an age of ever more productivity, attachment to our screens, and a fear that we're becoming automatons, cyborgs that don't function without our technologies. I love this quote from Anne Lamott: almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. So rest is no longer simply a posture of repose. It's a tool for combating modernity, an instrument for constructing cultural identities, and a technology of resistance. I theorize that it's also employed as a method of defying death zones created by necropolitics before and within the COVID-19 pandemic. Necropolitics is an elaboration of Michel Foucault's theory of biopolitics, asserted by Achille Mbembe, who writes, racism is a technology aimed at the exercise of biopower. The function of racism is to regulate the distribution of death and to make possible the murderous factions of the state. Tony Sansett furthers Mbembe's argument that necropolitics should fix its gaze on the everyday death worlds created by health inequality and the conditions that foster ill health and premature deaths across the globe. I would argue that the pandemic indeed created death worlds where dispensable bodies were exposed to a slow and steady violence. This was done by sacrificing these dispensable bodies, often bodies of color, to high contact, high risk frontline jobs, while the relatively well-off remained protected. Within an already medicalized yogic milieu, the symptom and symbol of exhaustion has prompted a revolution of restorative yoga for race-based trauma and yogic rest as resilience. Both COVID-19 and state-sanctioned killings like that of the highly publicized murder of George Floyd demonstrate that indeed, to quote Tony Sansett, certain lives are more protected than others and some lives are less grievable than others. I propose that in this landscape, restorative yoga and shavasana as the practice of embodying a corpse are employed as bodily techniques of sympathetic magic. Embody the fear of death, practice dying, fight death with death. Mbembe argues that death and freedom are irrevocably interwoven. One is free to live one's own life only because one is free to die one's own death. So yoga teachers like Dr. Gail Parker and previously mentioned Octavia Rahim are seeking both freedom and a reclamation of the right to lie down, to mimic death, to grieve, to put an end to the suffering, to care for oneself and community. Exhaustion and rest are metaphorical, but the social implications of the deployment are cultural, medical, and political. So I intend to continue to analyze the social life of yogic rest. There are so many areas I'd like to research, but I'll share just a few here in the hopes that someone listening has a lead they might send my way. Any textual instances in the Hatha corpus, perhaps particularly of Mritasana, but others as well. That was given to me as a synonym. And also I'd like to dive deeper into the science of Shavasana. Thus far, I found a very small 1998 study in which recovery from induced physiological stress was greater after explicitly doing Shavasana as opposed to resting chair or resting supine posture. I'm curious if there's a mandate for rest in Ayurveda. And those are my big questions that perhaps you all can help me with. I've hopefully demonstrated that Shavasana is a helpful lens through which to view questions of modernity, the evolution of contemporary yoga practice, socio-cultural views on death, biology, consciousness, language, art, politics, and community. Rest is political and medical, all at once a tool for fighting the patriarchy, capitalism, ails of modernity, and racism. It's a resource for self-preservation and also communal regulation. Thank you. I very much look forward to your thoughts, insights, questions, and comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Erica. That was very rich. I think it struck me that Shavasana has an interesting history. And I think if I remember correctly, you said it wasn't soteriological really within the tradition, but I think it starts out as soteriological when we get those first mentions in the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, because it's a method of laya, which is dissolving the mind and thereby sort of achieving samadhi. But then as you showed, as you look through the text, after that, it becomes more about just relaxing the body. And I mean, maybe there's an echo of that in this idea of chitta vishranti and relaxation of the mind. But yes, it seems to become somewhat mundane within our what we can see in our historical sources, and now it's kind of flourished again. It seems to sort of go against the grain of what people generally would say about yoga tradition. That seems to have taken on, remarkable, quite esoteric notions within these movements that you were looking at. I've got one sort of very specific question, which is, when you talked, you showed a slide with Krishnamacharya and his sort of injunction to practice shavasana at the end of a practice session, because I was wondering what the teachers say will happen if you don't do it. And actually you did sort of answer that in that in your ethnography, people said it's good for calming down the nervous system. Krishnamacharya's argument seemed a bit weak, or the reasons behind his injunction, if I understood it correctly, was, well, you're going to be sweaty, so if you go outside, then and you'll get in the breeze, and you'll get that famous Indian horror of the thought of catching a chill or something and getting a bit cold. So it seemed to be that he's suggesting you stay inside and you rub sweat into your body and dry off, and then you can go out. But what's the sort of, what's the worst that can happen if you don't do shavasana? What do people say about that?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And so he does differentiate between rest and shavasana. And he says that the yoga practitioner must rest rather than take shavasana. He says the yoga practitioner must rest. And he does give a time mandate, which I think is interesting, for 15 minutes. It's the first instance that I've come across of a time imposition. The yoga practitioner must rest for 15 minutes, keeping the body on the floor. So it's quite specific. And if you don't, then a breeze will enter your body. Sort of perhaps speaking to these winds, you and I were emailing a little bit earlier, winds that are mentioned in relationship to shavasana in the earlier hatha corpus. But a breeze will enter the body through the minute pores on the skin, and it can cause disease.
Okay, it's like the wind that actually goes. I thought it was just you go outside, and the idea was if you're sweaty, then you catch a chill and then you get ill. Okay, it's a bit more.
This has many kinds of disease.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then just one other, one small point about the palanka. That was interesting in light of what we were discussing today. I sent you that citation from a much later text saying that there's this Ardha Shavasana, which is also called Paryanka or Palanka.
Yeah, I'm going to have to take a deeper look into that. Unfortunately, I couldn't quite integrate that in time. But
it was a bit late, but it might be an interesting avenue to go down there.
Yeah, and Ruth McNeil, if you're still in here, her dissertation was quite helpful on that as well, sort of this difference between the Buddhist canon and what the Patanjali Yoga Shastra says. This sort of soteriology of uprightness, whereas now we're sort of moving into this soteriology of supineness, of lying down. There's almost a salvific, as you said, component, and as Mark Singleton has noted, to the practice of rest and relaxation as it's done today.
Another potential avenue thinking about it, I think in Hemachandra, I don't know if you've looked at his Yoga Shastra, the auto commentary. I think some of the postures there involve lying down, but not necessarily like a corpse, other forms of lying down.
I'll have to look deeper. I did look at Kayot Sarga, the casting off of the body, which can be done lying down.
I think there's a couple of others.
Yeah, so I'll take a deeper look at that. Thank you.
Okay. So we're surprisingly quiet in the Slido here. There's no questions there. Presumably everyone's taking time out to relax. Oh, someone's just appeared, and it's anonymous. But sometimes the name suddenly appears. So I'll give it a second or two. But
and then I have one as well, Jim.
Oh yeah, okay. Okay. I can go to you. Well, the anonymous one, which I'm trying to, have you explored the role of Shavasana in Yin Yoga, and furthermore the replacement of corpse pose with Sukhasana in neo-tantric MPY modern postural yoga practices like Anusara?
Thank you for the question. I have looked at Shavasana in Yin Yoga, and one of the areas that I'm curious to look at is really the sort of difference that's happening in more dynamic practices, how dynamic practices, one like Ashtanga yoga or Jivamukti, might differ in its relationship to rest and Shavasana as opposed to already sort of restorative and relaxing practices like Yin. And I've spoken to a few Yin teachers. One of the poses that I think that's interesting in Yin is the rebound pose. So in between poses, as I understand it, there's a practice of lying flat and still, and it's called the rebound. And so there's this necessary pausing between poses that, again, as I understand it thus far, is for integrating the pose that you just did, integrating the body learnings that have just happened. And so there's this rebound in Yin that seems to me quite like Shavasana. If you have any insights that you'd like to share, I welcome them. As far as Sukhasana in Anusara, I have taken a couple Anusara classes, but I haven't noticed that replacement. So I'd really love your insights and whatever information you can share. Please do send me an email.
Okay, great. And so, yeah, thanks for that. And we'll go to Theo now. Theo's got a question.
First of all, I'm also not aware of the replacement of Shavasana by within Anusara as a general thing. It may be specific to particular teachers, but I'm not aware of that from that. It's a long time since I've taken an Anusara class, but I took a lot of them when I did. So yeah, I'm not aware of that replacement of Sukhasana for Shavasana, but that's not what I wanted to say. What I wanted to talk about, but given that your title is politicization and you're talking a little bit about things like Nat ministry and so on and so forth, one of the threads for that, I think it might be interesting to follow, is into disability activism, and particularly around chronic fatigue and things like that. Because on the one hand, we have this kind of rise of sanctioned rest for kind of healthy people, but on the other hand, for chronically ill, particularly chronic fatigue and similar things, the standard therapy up until very, very recently has been graded exercise therapy, which is that you actually need to move more, despite the fact that that has no scientific evidence behind it. So I know that the ME and CFS community have been spent years trying to get graded exercise therapy taken off because it was harming lives in various ways. So that question of who gets to rest and who doesn't, and who's kind of malingering by resting and who isn't, I think is, I would follow, like I say, the disability activism thread on that. I think is going to be a lot of where the kind of activism comes from in that respect.
That's really rich. Thank you. And I'm also seeing in the questions, an anonymous person said, in practical terms, how does doing less equate to doing more in terms of social activism and inequality? Is rest still the privilege of those that can afford to? And I think that ties into what you're saying, and is also a really important thread to follow, because yes, rest is still very much a luxury. So, and it's only afforded to those who can take it. So I'm curious, again, in this case studies that I'm going to be carrying out, in what ways is rest being reclaimed? How is rest sort of being asked for by folks who have been marginalized and haven't had the time and space? And in what ways is it privileged? In what ways are people trying to make the space for it for those who would like it,
and again, what is the difference between a sanctioned practice, which is something very specific and something that you are actively doing even if you're resting, and just taking a nap, right? And like, which ones are we allowed to do and which ones are we not? And when you were talking, I think one of your questions is also how that then gets quantified into the technology, the wearables, those kinds of things. So you can take rest, but you have to, it has to be surveilled, it has to be quantified, it has to be you have to learn how to do it and do it well.
And
you can't just
go ahead.
No, you're just saying that you can't just have a nap. That's somehow not allowed.
Yeah, and in some ways, like it also has to be productive, right? Like sort of counter.
Yeah.
Like your nap has to be worthwhile. Like your nap has to mean something. Your nap has to, it still fits into this system of productivity and creation and doing. You know, you can't just lie down.
Yeah. And I thought that with the quote you pulled up that you love about, you know, everything tends to work better if you switch it off for a few minutes. Like the idea that I would have a nap or a yoga nidra or whatever in order to then be able to work better later, just that feels exhausting in and of itself. Like, maybe I could just have a nap, but maybe that's allowed.
Yeah, maybe that's enough. Maybe rest is enough. Maybe, you know, 3 minutes of lying down. I did have one informant tell me, if you're not tired, you don't need to take Shavasana, you know, if you're fine. But it was only one person. Everyone else says it's essential, it's crucial, even if it, you know, in trauma sensitive situations, you can offer alternatives and different ways of doing it, but the rest is so crucial, you know. So I think that's really interesting.
Nice.
Great, thanks. Well, if we can go for a couple more minutes, well, it's just a couple of comments really now in the Slido. We've got an anonymous, well, it's a statement with a question mark at the end. I heard Iyengar suggest Shavasana could be attained in any pose. Do you know about that?
I don't know.
Yeah, so that might be worth looking into. And then and Nikki has put in a reflection: the uprightness versus Shavasana also speaks to vertical and horizontal, individual austerities versus social or collective resistance. That's nice.
Thank you.
And then finally, so well, I have to say thank you very much, Erica, for your paper, because we have now got questions coming for Anja from Alexander. So yeah, thanks very much. Well done. That was great and very very provocative. Lots of things to think about from that. Alexander, can we go to you with your question for Anja, please?
Yeah, hello. Sorry for not showing myself. My device doesn't have video option. So my question is about Ājīvikas. So they are known for very severe practices, ascetic practices. And the question is, so why they did do this if everything is predetermined according to their religious view. So I know that Bronkhorst and Peter Barcelovich, they offered some solutions for this problem, but I would like to see what you think about it, Anja.
Thank you, Alexander. First of all, I think it's the logicality of the path of liberation that asceticism is necessary to stop all activities. However, it does not hasten the process. And I read Bronkhorst's theory, and in the end I go with him that and the way I understand it, that he says that the body is separated from the soul, and once that is done, then the body does the way by itself. So asceticism happens in the end when liberation is close by. That's how I understand the theory, and in the end that's what I agree with Bronkhorst's theory in that point. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Should we get a response from Alex? I'm not sure.
If not, it's fine. Yeah.
Well, thank you, anyway. Thanks, Anja. Thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for all the great questions. The next session is Wednesday, same time, I believe. Yes. I think that's right. So we've got Borayin Larios is going to be chairing then, and we have 4 papers that evening. So I look forward to seeing you all again then. And maybe I should hand back to Theo. There's probably a bit more housekeeping. So
it's such a pleasure to be again with all of you virtually. Some of you, many of you actually, I met very recently in Krakow. We had the opportunity to be together. I see quite a few faces that I had the opportunity to finally meet. Had that international conference, Yoga Darshana, Yoga Sadhana Methods, Migrations and Mediations that happened, wow, it's already longer than a month ago in Krakow, and online as well, for those of you who participated virtually. And I see a number of faces and names that I'm not familiar with, and I see others that I've known for many, many years. Hello, Nikki. And I'm just really, really happy that the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies has launched this initiative. I think we had the first graduate conference last year, if I'm not wrong, which was, a great success. And I'm glad that we're repeating this. I think that having a safe space for graduate students is something marvelous, and that it's only beginning to be recognized in the academic world as something not just as a space for students to sort of make their first experiences as researchers, but also to recognize that the dialogue between sort of senior scholars and younger scholars is one that is very fruitful, and that we can also learn a lot from young scholars and fresh ideas emerging from the field, the vast field of yoga studies. So I'm really, really happy that we're continuing with this tradition in 2022, and I'm also grateful to be part of this. And it's also a pleasure to be the chair of the second session or panel that will deal with 4 very interesting papers, mostly dealing around topics dealing mostly around the transmission of yoga in pedagogical terms. But you will be surprised to hear also from other scholars. And I don't want to take too much time because time is limited. And if we're going by the schedule that I received, our first speaker is it's Adriana Maldonado Galarza, right? Who will be talking to us about the role of absorption in modern postural yoga, secular minds, practices, and rituals. Adriana, welcome. Please feel free to share.
Thank you, Borayin. And thank you, Theo, and the Center of Yoga Studies. Good evening, everyone. Let me share my screen. Ooh, just a sec. Okay, so my presentation today is a bit of a hybrid or in between a possible and hopeful PhD proposal and my dissertation, my MA dissertation. The MA I finished last year at SOAS. And the name is, the title is The Role of Absorption in Modern Postural Yoga, Secular Minds, Practices, and Rituals. My research proposal has to do with modern yoga, but my dissertation reviewed the history of yoga. It's about exploring the role of absorption in modern postural yoga, and yoga understood as a modern and secular practice that is often linked with spirituality. And my hypothesis is that the key to this association between yoga and spirituality is in absorption and engaging attention to access altered states of consciousness. I believe, and I think, and there are a few techniques and practices and modern rituals that allow individuals to experience spirituality through altered states of consciousness. And not only through sitting meditation, but also they can involve movement, and sometimes vigorous movement and breathing practices. But also there is a philosophical context that goes and affects this experience of practitioners. So I'm drawing, as I said before, from my dissertation that was called Attentional Control and Trance as the key aspects of yogic well-being. And my idea was to take the most of my MA at SOAS. So I thought I need to find something that will make me read as much as possible to impregnate myself of yogi studies. So I thought, let's find a common denominator of yoga from its earliest definition to our days. And I thought, let's find what is the meaning of yoga. So I went to what Mallinson and Singleton argue is the first definition of yoga in the Katha Upanishad. And I'm just going to read it for you if it's okay. When the 5 perceptions are stilled together with the mind, and not even reason bestirs itself, they call it the highest state. When senses are firmly brought in, that is yoga, so people think. From distractions, a man is then free. For yoga is the coming into being as well as the ceasing to be. As you can see, there's different elements in this definition. Towards the end of the definition, you can see a sort of transformation from something to something else of the practitioner. But for me, the most important concept here was concentration or attentional control. And because of context, we know that at this time, there was an intention or a goal for absorption, for concentration, that it was going to an absorption state or yogic state or meditation state. So a bit of the background. When I studied more and more about attentional control and concentration leading to absorption, I realized that this is important for yoga traditions, for Indian religious traditions, but actually is also important for nearly all religious traditions. And I never thought about that because nearly all the religious traditions were trying to find a way to alter their states of consciousness. So they were doing contemplation, different ways of meditation, and all these things were associated with spirituality. They developed not only meditation techniques, but also they were developing, for example, in Indian traditions, mantra and other gestures and rituals and things that will allow the individual to experience, sometimes through absorption, spirituality. And that was actually, or is perhaps still, a human need. Yes, so humans need to experience different states of consciousness. And the model of classical yoga, classical as for example, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, was to move from a focused mind that is dharana, concentration or attentional control, towards a state of concentration that is called ekagrata, one-pointedness of mind. And if the practitioner, the yogi, was able to hold ekagrata for a certain period of time, they will enter a state of absorption, sometimes called a trance state or a yogic trance. There is a definition here of the 19th century by Monier Williams, and it's quite a long definition, so I'm not going to read it, but in the definition, he says basically yoga is concentration to enter absorption, but also mentions a goal, and the goal is union of the practitioner with Ishvara, or the Supreme Spirit. English dedicated a lot of his time to trance experiences. And he says experience of ecstatic trance that can be a meditation, often gives sensation of experience or an absorption experience will make people
I'm no longer hearing Adriana. Am I the only one having the same problem?
No, I'm having the same problem. I think she's still theoretically in the call, but I think she's having problems.
All right, she's gone now.
She's gone. All right, I'm going to suggest we move to our next speaker. We can always come back to Adriana if she makes it back.
Oh no, I think she's
back
here.
already?
She's here, but Adriana, can you hear us? Because we can. You are muted. You'll have to reshare your screen.
Apologize. I'm very sorry.
You're back. Thank goodness. Yes.
Has it been long?
About just a few seconds.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I continue?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I'm very sorry about that. So I was just saying that during my dissertation, I try to review a little bit of what was attentional control throughout the history of yoga. And there is two types of attentional control or concentration. One is a goal-oriented concentration, and there is a stimuli-oriented concentration. And in general, in the history of yoga, there's always been this goal-oriented meditation, usually, or processes of concentration to lead to absorption. For example, concentrating on God or a point in the body. And when we moved along the history of yoga towards Hatha yoga, there is more complex goal-oriented meditations, visualizations, complex breath control techniques, gazing points like drishti, and also complex postures. And when we move towards a bit later, we see that there is also evidence of these concentration techniques that previously were only used for meditation that start being used while performing asana. And then in the 20th century, we come back to a less complex concentration techniques, like, for example, Krishnamacharya. But in his definitions of postures, the more complex the asana, the more spiritual the effect. And it's quite interesting because he's mixing also concentration techniques used previously in classical yoga for meditation while performing asana, like, for example, looking at the tip of the nose and, of course, breath control. And if we move along later in history, I identified that there was a break at some point after Iyengar Pattabhi Jois, and this I identified as being Bandas Caravelli, that there is a stimuli-oriented attentional control that is promoted. So instead of she saying, like, let's focus on this point or something, she says, listen to your body, listen to or feel your body, and movement becomes a spiritual practice as opposed to asana mixed with philosophical discourses. Let me, what is not, okay, so I mentioned quite a few words already, and you may find it a bit confusing, but the fact is that I'm analyzing a type of phenomenon that authors use in different words, express themselves in different words. Some people use trance, some people use ecstasy, sometimes people use altered state of consciousness. I've chosen to use absorption because it's just there is a lot of controversy of using these terms. So obviously there is need of research. And many activities can induce absorption: music, sports, cooking, gardening, and there is already evidence that changing your state of consciousness to a different state of consciousness can be beneficial to mental health. And we call it flow, particularly when we are talking about an activity. That changing from focus concentration to sort of absorption is often called flow in our days. Modern postural yoga can induce absorption, but there are many questions, and it's here where I will try through my research to find what matters to people if they're experiencing this sort of thing, even if it's for a few seconds through Shavasana or standing in Samasthiti. So which techniques can help people to access absorption? Which factors affect this process? What are the experiential outcomes? And is it effectively linked with spirituality? And if it's good for their well-being? And I'm drawing from different authors, and probably I don't have time to go through all of them. But at first is Johannes Bronkhus that's written a book on absorption, and it's called Absorption. And he says basically, while entering states of absorption, the practitioner feels pleasure and release of bodily tension. Then I'm looking into Peter Connelly's work that it can be look controversial because he uses the word trance that is not that much used between scholars for some reason. I think it's because the relationship of trance with shamanism and sometimes even talking about pathology. But for me, as I said before, the phenomena, yes, of the accessing states of absorption is really well studied by Peter Connelly. He says that there's a spectrum of depth in states of absorption or trance. There are different methodologies to access. It can be self-induced, group induced by a different person. It can be affected by the atmosphere. And basically, he says a yogic experience is a trance experience. And then from Stuart Sarvaker, I take quite a few things, and he's really interested in this precise subject, because he says, and if we go back to Peter Connolly about the methodology will affect experience, he says that yoga was taught as a spiritual practice. So if you are teaching and preaching philosophy, then it's quite likely that while you're experiencing absorption, you may take from that, like we said before, as a goal-oriented meditation. So my key points is one, that absorption is beneficial for mental health. Second, that a key aspect that characterizes modern postural yoga and influences altered states of consciousness is in mixing concentration techniques, philosophical teachings, and physical practices. I'm talking about modern postural yoga, and it's as a spiritual, it's spread across secular and non-religious milieux, and there are new rituals that are being created to support that sort of experience. Yes, so this study will aim to bring clarity to the role of absorption and concentration within the practice of yoga, the development of new practices and rituals, and how these have evolved into the modern westernized postural yoga versions. I believe that will inform scholars, teachers, and practitioners of yoga. Thank you, and I have to thank many people, but that I listed them that helped me in my dissertation and towards my PhD. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana, for your presentation. And sorry that we had a bit of a disruption with the internet connection, but we still managed to get your main points. So in terms of the process of having this panel, we still have 3 more presentations, and we have the Slido platform where you can ask questions for Adriana. And given that we don't have that much time, I would suggest that if there are pressing questions that that you type them now in Slido, and we can address them now. And if not, if there are no pressing questions right now, then I would suggest we move to the second presentation, and then we will have time for questions and discussion also at the end.
Agreed. We don't have any questions in at the moment, and sometimes it takes a while for people to think of them. So yeah, agreed. I think we move to the next person, and that doesn't mean to say you can't ask a question to Adriana, but
exactly.
We'll come to Adriana later. But if you could put the name of the person who you're asking in your question, that would really be helpful, so we know who you're asking. That would be great.
Exactly. So for Adriana or for Martha, Martha Henson is our next speaker. Welcome, and you will be talking us about the Yoga Sutras, and sorry, I don't have, for some reason I forgot to print the title of your presentation, I have it here.
From monkey mind to inner
Exactly.
silence. What could permanent loss of inner speech in meditators tell us about its function? Here we go.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you. And Martha, also not to take more time from your presentation, please go ahead and share your screen if you have slides to share.
I do. How's that?
Wonderful. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so hi, thank you, Borayin, and thank you to everyone at the Centre for organising this conference. It's great to be part of such a fascinating programme. So as mentioned, this is actually a very heavily summarised version of my dissertation research for the MA in Traditions of Yoga and Meditation at SOAS, the title being From Monkey Mind to Inner Silence, What Could Permanent Loss of Inner Speech in Meditators Tell Us About Its Nature and Function? Or in other words, if inner speech is so useful, why do meditators want to lose it? And I'm going to unpack that a bit over the next 14 minutes or so. So my starting point was coming across in actually one particular account of a modern account of a long-term meditator who claimed that they had permanently lost their inner speech. as someone who experiences quite a lot of inner speech, I found this really fascinating. Like, how could you lose it? What does that mean? What are the implications for what it is and what it does? And in fact, this is the quote that I'd found, talking about someone, Vinay Gupta, who claims to have meditated for 6 years before this experience, and then one day had this visualization during which he says, my internal dialogue completely stopped and it never came back. So I then went to have a look at the scientific literature on inner speech and found, like, for a start, quite surprisingly, it's relatively poorly studied until quite recently, which again made me interested, because I thought, well, maybe the experience of these meditators, if I can find more, can shed some light on this, like, quite poorly understood question. But there has been a lot more interest in it recently, and lots of different methodologies trying to get at what that experiences of inner speech might be and what they might be for. As you can imagine, quite a difficult thing to study. As yet, we don't have any means of reading people's minds. So obviously having to put people in scanners and so on, but then how do you generate natural inner speech and so on? All very complex. But still, there are a variety of theories of what it might be for, and whether those are looking at its role in potentially short-term memory, planning and problem solving, self-regulation, rehearsal, maybe creativity and mind wandering, perhaps even linking different brain areas together, a way of them talking to each other. All of these things assume that it has some sort of utility, by and large. So there appears to be a conflict here between the view within the cognitive sciences and potentially this view within meditation. So what's going on? What does this tell us about inner speech? Are potentially meditators demonstrating that it's not this useful, that they're useful after all, or maybe are they doing themselves some sort of harm? So I'm going to look at some more examples from both historical and contemporary sources. Before I do that, I just want to take a little bit of a step back and have a look at what inner speech is. Another complexity with this is that there isn't necessarily even an agreed and consistent way of talking about it. This quote from Löwenbroek within, I think, a more scientific context shows you the variety of terminology being used. And even there's some contradiction here, like, is it a monologue or is it a dialogue? I think probably different people experience it in different ways. But I'm going to use inner speech because it seems to be increasingly more commonly used and well understood. But what is it? I quite like Langdon, Hassan and Vicenti's definition of thinking in words. That's quite nice. In general discussion, you might hear people talking about the kind of the voice in our head. But yes, as I said, I'm going to stick with inner speech. Another quote that I like, because I think it demonstrates why it might have been so difficult to study, came from Riley, who said, the fact of its insistent indwelling can blind us to its peculiarities. So it's often conflated with thought, and I think very difficult to untangle from thought. So partly, one of the reasons why I think when people have talked about thought within the neuroscience, psychology, experimental psychology, they haven't then unpicked like what that thought actually is. So is thought the same thing as inner speech? This is an issue not just for the theory of what it might be, but also for language. So when I'm looking back at sources, both contemporary and historical, it's relatively unlikely that people will be using words that directly translate as inner speech, more likely thought. So is it reasonable for me to make the assumption that those two things are the same? I believe it is. So for example, the work of Russell Hulbert, which is using some really interesting techniques to get at people's internal experience, found that whilst people do experience inner speech, there are also 4 other types of frequently occurring inner event, including sensory experience or feelings and emotions. And actually people who do experience inner speech, because not everyone does, for those people, they tend to overestimate their inner speech. However, for most people, and at least some of the time, thoughts are inner speech. So terms that are synonymous with thought are really very likely to signify inner speech. So I think it's reasonable to look for those terms. I was also looking for, particularly terms that illustrated its verbal nature, but also I believe it's implicit in concepts describing its negation, for example, inner silence or an undisturbed mind. So another relationship is inner speech thought itself or merely a vehicle for it? If we do our thinking with the inner speech, then presumably if we lose it, we're losing the ability to think. But if it's just a kind of a medium for it, one of many, then perhaps the thought can happen without its subsequent expression in a speech. In other words, potentially unconsciously. So hold that thought and we'll come back to it. So when I started digging around for other accounts, for which I read an awful lot of awakening and enlightenment accounts, various meditation manuals and so on, this was one of the ones that seemed most explicit. This is a quote from Gary Weber, who's written a couple of books about this, but this is actually from an interview with him. And he said, after 25 years practicing Zen meditation, postural yoga, and Vedic self-inquiry, he had this experience where he got into a yoga pose, a pose he'd done thousands of times before. And when he moved out of it, his thoughts stopped permanently. I should say, I'm not offering in this paper right now a critique of these sources. They come from a really wide variety, mostly non-academic, populist, and so on. So I'm just going to present the various quotes, and I believe that they're indicative, but let's see what you think. So this is what he says happens to him. He says the old thought track never comes back for him. And similarly to Gupta, he said that this has had no detrimental effect on him. He's able to go about his business. He's still able to make decisions. It hasn't affected his day-to-day life. In fact, he generally believes that his experience has been positive. Some other accounts came from some of the most explicit accounts discussing this. And again, it was quite hard to find really explicit ones because of that, lots of these kind of conflations and entanglements. But here we have a quote from Daniel Ingram's Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, a somewhat irreverent manual that claims to be based on personal experience. So he's talking about, in this section, the potential outcomes of enlightenment, and one of which potentially being this sort of state of no thought. He talks about someone who wrote to him and said, I did some Taoist practices, got enlightened, and I'm now incapable of thinking any thoughts or visualizing, yet I seem to function normally. What do you think of this? He goes on to say that, yes, this is something that you hear as a potentially a goal or outcome of various practices. But he says that this is not explicitly a goal of Buddhism in his interpretation, as the Buddha is clearly described as having verbal thoughts after awakening. I should say also that for this research, it doesn't really matter whether this is a genuine sign of awakening or not, for the purposes of like this being interesting to cognitive sciences. If this is happening at all, it doesn't even have to be universal within these traditions, or particularly these South Asian traditions that I'm looking at. If this is happening at all, it is of interest. So this is this one example. And then the second from Path to Nirvana, a guide to meditation by David Johnson. He also talks about the experience of past students who have done his meditation practice, or the meditation practice he describes. One of whom says that he finds that eventually there is tremendous silence in the mind, and goes on to say, it's like the mind of an infant, by which I mean that the mind is empty of concepts, empty of thoughts, empty of identity, and so on. The emphasis is mine, because empty of thoughts and empty of identity, I think, are very interlinked. And again, I will come back to that. I'm not going to read all of these out. These are various sources from, you might call it a sort of online ethnography that I did, so hunting around on subreddits, various forums, social media, and so on, finding more examples of people talking about meditation practices leading to this loss of inner speech, or at least like heavily changing inner speech. Interestingly, not all of these are saying that their experiences are positive, or they find it quite unnerving, but often they are. So I wanted to have a look at whether this was also reflected in historical traditions. Is there a continuity here between what's going on, what appears to be going on for at least some people in contemporary practices, with what happened in the past? Now, obviously, I'm not looking for a personal experience here. That's not what these historical texts tend to do, but I didn't have to go far to find something that seemed very suggestive. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, the second sutra, generally translated as something along the lines of, yoga is to stop the turnings of the mind. I find it hard to imagine what that might be if it's not referring to sort of particularly verbal thoughts and thoughts turning. And indeed, in many modern popular translations, people often use terms such as mental chatter and so on. The Bhashya, the commentary, expands here. There is no cognition of anything in the state. That's a translation by Leggett. And actually now, if we go all the way to the end of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, there is discussion of the end state of samadhi in some detail. And the commentary here on Sutra 429 elaborates. Because the samskara seed of taint is destroyed, For him, no other ideas are created. Again, Leggett's translation. Elsewhere, that latter part has been translated as no other thoughts arise in him by Mallinson and Singleton. So how does this help with the whole process of sort of recognizing the Purusha? Because these mental fluctuations are obscuring the truth. In Vivekananda's obviously much later commentary on the second sutra, he puts it like this: the bottom of the lake we cannot see because its surface is covered with ripples. It is only possible for us to catch a glimpse of the bottom when the ripples have subsided and the water is calm. The bottom of the lake is our true self. And I actually found that quote in Grinchpon's book on the Yoga Sutra. And he also emphasizes silence as the liberating characteristic of the yogin, and points out that in the early sutras, the activities listed that must be stopped to achieve the silent, still mind are mostly, in his words, conscious verbal activities. In the later Hatha Yoga Pradipika, there are various references to the necessity of a clear mind. And then towards the end, these other quotes about all thoughts being abandoned. For example, by transcending the mind, which is composed of constructive thought, definitely peace will be attained, O Rama. Another example here from the Maitreya Upanishad, which I think is particularly interesting because I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I think what we might be seeing here is repression of inner speech through physical means. There is some suggestion through because of subvocalization and sort of motor effects of inner speech that you could perhaps suppress it by using this technique of pushing the tip of the tongue up into the palate. Really interestingly, there's also some indication of this also from within Buddhist texts. So this other one about clenching teeth and tongue pressing down to cause these unskillful thoughts to be abandoned, which to me is also suggestive that they're particularly trying to get rid of inner speech. I had a look at other Buddhist texts. There's some indication that these sort of references to thoughts leaving in the sort of the second jhana of this process. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because it's not really clear whether this is really just a temporary thing rather than sort of like a permanent effect. But there is more reference to within the Buddhist tradition to potentially inner speech being something of an enemy. There's the discussion of the sort of the stream of consciousness being a sort of a monkey that moves from one branch to another, not letting go of one until he clutches another, and sort of the implication that this is a negative thing. And this monkey mind metaphor has really persisted into lots of texts today. And in modern texts, there are a lot more, particularly populist books on yoga and meditation, a lot of discussion about the unhelpful monkey mind or crazy puppy mind, and sort of the idea that you're kind of working towards a quiet mind and silence, a sort of a softer formulation, apparently, of what Patanjali perhaps was talking about. And finally, in terms of the evidence that I'm presenting, there's some really intriguing and suggestive stuff from some neuroscientific studies on meditators. Unfortunately, the two key things I found were in references to texts, to studies that were not published yet, and I really wish they were because they sounded fascinating. So Jeff Warren, who took part in a brain scan study of meditators, said that what they found was that long-term meditators were apparently unable to let their minds wander. It was as if, quote, they had long ago shed the habit of entertaining discursive narrative thoughts. Another intriguing testimony comes from Russell Hurlburt, as mentioned before, referencing this work in another book chapter without going into detail. He says he carried out his methodology with, in his words, adept meditators, and showed that their internal experience was dominated by sensory awareness in comparison to non-meditators where inner speech is more common. So, to summarize in conclusion, I think there's something interesting going on here. And I think that it would be worthy of more extensive research. I'd love to carry out more qualitative research with meditators and try and find more. I'm really fascinated to hear if anyone else has examples, and potentially other scientific research. I think this supports other research, particularly from within psychology and neuroscience, that suggests that executive functions, decision-making, and so on operate unconsciously. Like we make decisions sometimes, some time perhaps, even before we're aware of them. I'm having a sort of inevitable cat interruption. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm just going to ignore it. So I think this really supports that view that perhaps the sort of our conscious thinking is not what is actually where the decisions are happening, because if we can lose it, then it's still able to make decisions. Apparently we didn't need it after all. I think there's a strong link to a loss of sense of self, and this whole no self doctrine will be very familiar to these students of Buddhism. And what I think might be happening here is that both are located in a network of the brain called the default mode network, which is sort of the idle mode of the brain. It's where our mind wanders and where a lot of inner speech perhaps is occurring. Now, this is much better. The link between the link between sense of self and default mode network, I think, is better understood. But the fact that both of these things are often lost at the same time in various examples suggests that, to me, they're both coming from the same place. I'd love to go into more detail, but just as a, recognizing the time, the proposed mechanism I'm suggesting here is that actually what's happening is that sustained acts of concentration are deactivating the default mode network. We know that default mode network is dampened down by sustained acts of concentration. I think the sort of repetitive nature of that in meditation means that eventually either the default mode network is sort of turned off, or that other networks are sort of strengthened in comparison, and that's sort of end effect. So what I'm saying is that concentration matters more than the object of focus. And you'll notice that these are various different practices with slightly different objects of focus. But overall, this raises many more questions that I'd love to have a chance to answer. And finally, I hope that this demonstrates that there is value in interdisciplinary research looking at the experiences of meditators from both historical and contemporary contexts to potentially shed some light on outstanding questions in the cognitive sciences. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. If you have any pressing questions for Martha, please.
We have one, actually.
Oh,
we do have one, yeah, from Weston, who I can ask to unmute.
Exactly. I see you are here in the audience. Maybe you want to.
Greetings. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you for that fascinating talk. I remember being slightly shocked when I heard a couple years back there was something making the rounds on social media that some people don't have an inner dialogue or inner speech. And I remember being like just completely mind blown that that was even a possibility. Anyways, my question is about sort of slightly methodological, but I'm curious if you or any other scholars have looked at the way that loss of inner speech reporting, like as a culturally situated phenomenon, like something along the lines of like alien abduction reports, or the way sleep paralysis or something. I mean, setting aside the question, which I think is useful, like setting aside the question of is it real or not, like the way that it's being talked and reported about, it seems like I would be curious to know how people might describe their loss of their loss of inner speech who don't have any familiarity with South Asian traditions, that see it as some sort of goal or something. I'm just curious if there's any discussion of this kind of like culturally situated phenomenon.
The short answer is I don't know. I mean, when you look at something like the way that the suggestion that is with abduction experiences, that was such a culturally recognizable phenomenon that sort of skewed people's interpretation of what might be other brain states, for example. I don't think that would be what was happening here, because I don't think this is very widely culturally recognized. I've found it quite hard to find examples of this, so I sort of doubt it, but I don't know. I mean, as I mentioned, I think this is really understudied. I'm surprised that people studying inner speech haven't been taking those people who don't have it already and putting them in brain scanners to find out what's happened. So I think there's just, it's a whole rich vein to sort of dig into here. So yeah, I think it's a good question, and it would be interesting to find out more.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. I think there's quite a bit that we can talk about in this discussion later, also regarding Adriana's question on altered states of consciousness and absorption, and what that means in terms of speech and the inner dialogues and the chit chats of the mind. But we can come back to that later. I'd like to invite Nikki Costello to share her presentation, and she will be talking to us about the guru-disciple relationship as a pedagogy of dialogue. Nikki, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here, to see your faces again after such a long time. Let me open up the screen. The guru-disciple relationship, a pedagogy of dialogue. This study began at SOAS as I was creating and developing my MA dissertation. Oops, sorry about that. Here's just a flow so that you can see the flow of this presentation. We'll begin with the abstract, an inductive task, and then you can see the list that follows. If you would just take a moment to look at this and see if anything stands out as unusual or interesting about this list. And then just hold that in your attention as we continue. I suggest that the guru-disciple or teacher-student relationship is a reciprocal one, insofar as a dialogical approach is at the foundation of learning. Reciprocity in this context can be understood as an exchange that is mutually beneficial and interdependent. The space of learning is co-created as a third space between the teacher and student, where generative themes emerge and form the basis of praxis and reflection. The learning and knowledge in dialogue has the potential for transfer and impact in one's life, both personally and socially. I propose that it is a dialogue which plays a major role in the liberatory function of education. We're going to pause here for a moment for what is called an inductive task. And I'm asking each of you to look at this here as I read it. As you listen, consider your active participation in this dialogue. Listening is at the foundation of our collective engagement. Can you begin to listen as an embodied practice? Listen for those themes that have resonance for you. Listen for ideas that spark your interest or provoke questions. I'll come back to this title, an inductive task, as we move through this talk. I'll say for now that a learning task or an inductive task is and has been created by the educator Jane Vella, who was one of the influential teachers in this dissertation. Along with the growth of modern yoga as a transnational global phenomenon, yoga studies and research have expanded within academic circles, gathering considerable momentum since the 1990s. Scholars have also become more transparent about their personal engagement with yoga and meditation disciplines, employing the term scholar practitioner to signify their movement between these reciprocal disciplines. For academics, traditionally, one's personal practice remained hidden. In recent years, this new identity has been accepted and can be seen as an asset in attracting the next generation of students in both the university and yoga classrooms. Questions. Here are some of the questions that were percolating as I began to think about what is it in this dialogue in yoga studies that I wanted to not only investigate, but contribute? What was the pedagogical process that I had undertaken that would stimulate for myself and for students a new approach to learning, or at least an expanded approach? So here are some of the questions. What is the teacher-student relationship? How does learning happen? Is learning a transformative process? Does learning cultivate, change, or influence our behaviors? Are we co-creating our space of learning or accepting the one presented by the teacher? Lived histories. One of the educators that I studied in depth for this dissertation is Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire suggests that to truly understand the fundamental ideas in a pedagogy, we must look at the role that lived history plays in each individual, and particularly a teacher. It is impossible to understand human beings, including their philosophy and praxis, outside of the concrete historical, economic, and cultural conditions that shape their intellectual, emotional, physical, and spiritual sensibilities, and thus their ongoing evolution as cultural citizen of the world. This quote is by Darder, Antonia Darder, who is a student of Freire and wrote the handbook, The Way to Study his work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And now, with regard to my own position, I began practicing Iyengar yoga in New York City in 1997 and received my first teaching certificate from BKS Iyengar in 2008. As an insider in this tradition, I have direct experience with its pedagogical methods. The presentation that I'm offering today is a small bit of a, of course, larger dissertation. So I've chosen not to completely go into the aspect of this dissertation, which looked at the lived history of each of the educators that I studied and whose pedagogy I've been influenced by. But it was an enormous part of how the dissertation continued. And I welcome you to read that, and I'll give you a link to that as we continue. And here is BKS Iyengar. I first met BKS Iyengar in the year 2000 when I was living in India and had the opportunity to go to Pune and meet him. It was at that time that I decided that I wanted to continue as his student, or as a student of Iyengar yoga. I had been engaged with the practice of Iyengar yoga through the book Light on Yoga, yet I had not yet found a teacher of Iyengar yoga that I wanted to study with in the United States. Here we are in this moment of departure from looking at the pedagogy of education and coming back to the pedagogy that is underlying, or I'll argue underlines, the Guru Shishya Parampara as a pedagogical model. When considering the model for yoga education, the Guru Shishya Parampara model has exerted significant influence on how a student approaches and perceives the role of the teacher. The Sanskrit term parampara literally means proceeding from one to another. It denotes the succession and passing of knowledge, a chain of transmission from teacher to student. In Hindu culture and religion, its key aspect is the ongoing relationship between teacher and student, guru and shishya, wherein the student comes over time to embody the knowledge that the master, guru, conveys through tutelage. Pause. This is a 30-second pause just to consider what has been shared thus far.
Nikki, sorry to interrupt your wonderful pause. And just to let you know that you have 5 more minutes left for your presentation.
Ah, okay. I set the timer here. I'll keep going. Thank you. Paulo Freire considers 3 goals of education. For Freire, education was not meant to prepare students for the world of subordinated labor or careers, but a preparation for a self-managed life. For a student to be self-managed, 3 central goals of education must be fulfilled. Cultivate self-reflection, that is an understanding of the world in which they live, its economic, political, and psychological dimensions. Engage a critical pedagogy as a means to help the learner become aware of the forces that have here to rule their lives and especially shape their consciousness. And set conditions for producing a new life where power has been transferred to those who literally make the social world by transforming nature and themselves. And here is another list, and this is where Paulo Freire argues that what we see in education is banking education. And this list begins with the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses, the teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students comply. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. The teacher chooses the program content and the students, who were not consulted, adapt to it. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she and he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. The teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. Problematizing the banking model. Why is this model problematic? Though the last statement, the teacher is the subject of learning process while the pupils are mere objects, is at the bottom of the list, it is the key to engaging with his critical analysis. When objectified, the student becomes a docile listener, a part of the privatized property of the teacher and under the influence of his narration, unknowingly relinquishes her power. Now, the quote just below this is one from BKS Iyengar, who shares, he is the guide, the guru who teaches the sadhaka to stand well, to walk, and to leap. He must have skill to know the student's needs, which the student cannot assess for himself. This is the quote that, in a sense, triggered in me from a lifelong practice and a lifelong learner and 30 years in the Iyengar method that I have considered problematic in terms of the dynamics that begin to unfold in the classroom, and why the dialogical approach is an approach that can, in fact, begin to change that. Bell Hooks has been an example of this change, and she writes, to engage in dialogue is one of the simplest ways we can begin as teachers, scholars, and critical thinkers to cross boundaries, the barriers that may or may not be erected by race, gender, class, professional standing, and a host of other differences. To educate as the practice of freedom is a way of teaching that anyone can learn, that learning process comes easiest to those of us who teach, who also believe that there is an aspect of our vocation that is sacred, who believe that our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. Now, another student of Paulo Freire, who I mentioned earlier, and who is responsible for giving me the context for understanding how to create a learning event, which is, in a sense, any classroom situation, is through the use of what is called learning design. In the learning design, the learner is invited into learning through questions and answers and dialogue. For a yoga student, this learning is also reflected in yoga's canonical scriptures. As a teacher, I need to discover what it is the student already knows, what they think they need, or what they want to know. This is where learning to listen plays a critical role, Paulo Freire writes. The dialogical nature of education begins with thematic investigation. These themes are vital, filled with energy and the willingness to learn. We are motivated to learn about those themes which are relevant to how we understand our own lives. In group learning sessions, learners come together and generate themes that will, in fact, shape the course. In summary, the naming of the world, which is an act of creation and recreation, is not possible if it is not infused with love. Love is at the same time the foundation of dialogue and dialogue itself. No matter where the oppressed are found, the act of love is commitment to their cause, the cause of liberation. And this commitment, because it is loving, is dialogical. I realized that my work in the academy would focus on pedagogical theory and practice. Yoga studies is a vast field, which includes history, philosophy, religion, and language. However, my concern lies in the modern yoga classroom that endeavors toward the liberatory function of education, where the teacher and student are subjects of learning. Here are just some links to learn more, and where this study of pedagogy has taken me is to, consideration of a PhD, and specifically embodied social justice and how learning to create dialogue in the classroom can shift the dynamics in that classroom to be more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and accessible. Thank you so much. And I'd like to just acknowledge all of you for your participation, the Center of Yoga Studies, and to each of our moderators. And of course, to my brilliant advisor and friend, Sean Hawthorne, who is continuing to push me toward further research and application. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikki, for this presentation. We're going to go straight to Therese Heinisch because time is running out. And we'll go into the questions. There are already some questions for Adriana and for Martha in the Slido, but we'll go to them once we hear from Therese. Please, Therese, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you. Can you see my screen already?
Yes, you just need to go full screen. Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay. First of all, my name is Therese Heinisch and my pronouns are she, her. And I thank everyone at the Center of Yoga Studies for hosting this event. And a special thank you goes to Theo for her generous guidance last week in the workshop. Like all the other presentations in this conference, my paper is part of my research conducted during my MA dissertation. I graduated from SOAS in the MA of Traditions of Yoga and Meditation in 2019. This is a while back, so I welcome anyone pointing me to new publications or directing, new directions for this research. Before I get into my work, I would like to be transparent about my positionality here. I am a white German female queer academic and yoga teacher. Those aspects of my identity and the related privileges, as well as the oppressions, reflect in my research unavoidably. Additionally, my research interest was sparked because I myself am involved in the conceptualization and conduction of several yoga teacher trainings. And I'm also a member now of the BD Yoga, which is one of the organizations that I'm looking at during this paper. I was not a member of them when I conducted this research though. So when I first started this dissertation, the hashtag #MeToo and the revelations around sexual assault in yoga lineages were very fresh and devastating. In that time, I began to ask myself, how is it possible for a yoga teacher to hold a position of power that can be abused so tremendously? And what is the ideological underpinning of such power dynamics? Obviously, I have not found the full or complete answer to these big questions. However, I can say that the greater structural system sheds its shadow on modern yoga as well. My hypothesis is that the neoliberal formation of modern postural yoga as a commodity in the marketplace led to such power imbalances. So, at first I'd like to clarify the setting on which my argument is situated. Yoga and yoga pedagogy are embedded in and instrumentalized through a neoliberal agenda. Or as Andrea Jain points out, much of what makes the contemporary postural yoga world is specific to its social context, consumer culture. The relatively new mode of transmission of modern postural yoga in this context is crucial. Modern postural yoga is transmitted and taught in yoga classes. We learned from Goldberg's work that this mode of transmission is fairly new, as it was invented by Yogendra in 1918. this brought forth a new profession as well, the yoga teacher. One of the functions of this new method of teaching is teaching to a large audience. And this essentially helps with the commodification of the practice as well. As Goldberg puts it, Yogendra transformed yoga from a spiritual quest into a service to the middle-class Indian consumer. This service could be bought, advertised, and evaluated. Establishing the yoga class meant putting postural yoga into a format that could be placed on the market. Yoga became and remains since that a commodity on the consumer market. So I was wondering what signifies this commodity? So here are just a few points. So modern postural yoga is suitable for a modern lifestyle. It doesn't have to be conducted in a hermitage. It has like a limited time that you can squeeze into your busy life and so on. It benefits health, or as Andrea Jane puts, also holistic health, so it benefits the mind, the body, and the spirit. And it emphasizes relaxation, as we have heard a wonderful presentation on Monday. And it emphasizes relaxation, not meditation, not prayer, but relaxation, which also is part of the next point, that it's a secular thing. It can be taught to a mass audience and also is often marketed as actually promoting productivity. So some of the underlying ideological discourses at play at the commodification of yoga are, and I will come back to those, modernism, nationalism, and individualism. The reason for me to point this out is that those ideologies are based and derived from colonial thought and respectively racist, patriarchal, and overall unjust hierarchical systems. The development of a commodified yoga was not free of those ideologies and hegemonic systems. Although the commodity yoga is widely marketed as available and accessible to everyone willing to put effort into it, the systematic structure in which yoga is set is unjust and therefore enables abusive relations as well as exclusivity of access to the practice. This might not be new to many of you, but the next bit might be. I will look at how the formation of yoga as a commodity in neoliberal capitalism is established through yoga teacher trainings. So for that, I conducted a case study involving 2 different organizations. And to understand better the involvement of the yoga teacher trainings and the institutions accrediting them, I conducted this case study. And the scrutiny here are the US-based Yoga Alliance, which probably all of you know. And the second one is the German BD Yoga, Berufsverband der Deutschen Yoga-Lehrenden, which kind of translates into a workers' union of the German yoga teachers, or of the yoga teachers in Germany. When I conducted this research, there was no reliable studies about yoga teacher trainings. So I drew largely on the self-representation of those organizations online and the requirements they set for yoga teacher trainings. So Yoga Alliance, I don't think I have to say much about it, but here are some of their self-declared goals. I highlighted the ones which are particularly interesting for my research here. BD Yoga is a nonprofit community-oriented organization in Germany, and it has been active since 1967 and describes itself as ideologically neutral. For the German speakers amongst you, weltanschaulich neutral, which I think is an interesting term. Both organizations have guidelines to generalize and unify the standards of yoga teacher trainings. According to Yoga Alliance, one can become a yoga teacher in 200 hours training. The BD Yoga requires 500 hours over a period of at least 2 years. So this table shows a breakdown of the teaching categories in percentage in relation to the total of hours taught. And when we look at the first row here, about personal practice, it makes up the biggest junction of the training. So teaching, training, and practice is the category at Yoga Alliance, makes up 60%, and the two categories of Hatha Yoga and meditation make up 43% at BD Yoga. This is the biggest part, considering the hours taught. BD Yoga does not give any further detail of how this should be conducted, whereas Yoga Alliance specifies, quote, topics in this category could include, but are not limited to, asana, pranayama, kriya, chanting, mantra, meditation, and other traditional yoga techniques. These hours should be a mix of A, analytical training in how to teach and practice the techniques, and B, guided practice to the techniques themselves. The emphasis on individual practice and effort in the yoga techniques is clear. How to teach yoga is only a small portion of this large category. Participants in yoga teacher trainings learn that personal practice, discipline, and dedication are the basis of individual improvement, as well as the basis of becoming a yoga teacher. No contextualization of that personal practice is required. The personal practice aims at achievement and individual betterment instead of healing, fully aligned with the neoliberalist narrative of individualism. When we look here at the second row, which is about teaching methodology, it strikes me that although participants should transform into educators, pedagogy and teaching methodology only makes up 12% of the hours taught. Interestingly, Yoga Alliance includes the business aspect of yoga into that category. So they say at a minimum of 4%, a maximum of 4% within these 12% can be about business. BD Yoga has its own category here, which is Berufskunde, which is a little bit different than business, but we don't have to go into that too much. This affiliation of yoga teaching methods with the business of yoga shows how deeply the teaching of yoga is defined by capitalism and market dynamics, or considering the other way around. Yoga Alliance amplifies the location of yoga education in consumer culture. The third row here is about physiology, and it's not so interesting for my argument. The only thing I'd like to highlight here is the discrepancy between those two numbers here, the 8% and the 17%, which is related to German health insurance system because they substitute yoga classes, or subsidize yoga classes. That's why you see this big discrepancy here. So the fourth row here about philosophy is a really interesting one as well. I think the teaching of philosophy makes up 15% of the hours taught at BD Yoga and 16% in Yoga Alliance. This is a really limited scope, and that limited scope on and emphasis on the theoretical backbone of yoga practice leaves little time for deeper discussions. Considering that most of the participants have heard very little about the religious and historical background of yoga before joining a teacher training, this time is filled with introducing the basics. This is one reason for the accentuation of certain yoga philosophies, mostly the mainstream ones. Due to the lack of time and accessible publications, certain philosophies are more present in yoga teacher trainings than others. It remains questionable if a critical engagement with the extensive yoga literature is possible in this setting. Additionally, the designation of this category as philosophy, lifestyle, and ethics underlines the secular nature of the yoga taught in yoga teacher trainings. There is no mentioning of religion, history, or the appropriation of religious thought. Yoga Alliance defines the principles introduced by Hindu and Buddhist traditions as, quote, yoga lifestyle, such as the precept of non-violence, ahimsa, and the concepts of dharma and karma, end quote. This goes along with an underlying modernist tone of the superiority of spirituality over religiosity.
Therese, can you wrap up soon?
Yes, I am about to.
Wonderful.
So yes, here are my concluding thoughts. The conclusion drawn from this is that the yoga teacher trainings are the place of production of the commodity yoga. It is important to honor that some facilitators make an effort to not do that, but it is a structural setting that's the problem here, I would say. In the case of Yoga Alliance, this relates back to the explicit function of the organization to protect the market, which they have on their website. I'll not go into detail with that. Teacher trainings reinforce a neoliberal formation of modern yoga by putting an emphasis on individual achievement rather than community teaching, understanding of the theoretical backbone or anything like that. Second, by offering a very limited insight into pedagogy and teaching techniques, which leaves very insufficient room for questions of one's own power as an educator or facilitator. And also by simplifying the vast theory of yoga into classical yoga philosophy, which reinforces male brahminical superiority over other voices, and by also appropriating Indic religious thought into secular spirituality. So therefore, I advocate for a reform of the yoga curricula and concepts in the teacher training. There is a need to rethink the way that yoga is taught. My dissertation includes the beginning of this rethinking process, which is quite similar to what Nikki actually showed us today. Unfortunately, I did not have time to share anything further with you, but I would be happy to have a conversation about that with anyone who's interested. So please reach out, and particularly Nikki, I would love to have a conversation with you about this. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Therese, for that fascinating presentation. Now we're going to have to go a little bit over time. I hope that's fine for everyone. It's almost 9:15 here in Vienna, 8:15 in the UK. But we will take a few questions for each of you, and I'll start. If from the Slido we have a question that I'd like to for Martha that I'd like to ask, which is anonymous. Is the ultimate goal in the loss of inner speech to become one with Purusha? Does this differ in Buddhist practice in terms of goal? That would be the first question for you.
So I think there's a question there about whether, to what extent the goal of inner speech is the explicit goal, but also I think what it's doing is creating the conditions for insight, for the sort of the liberating insight, and I think that probably is the case for both of those traditions, but to sort of slightly different extent. And obviously the nature of that insight is slightly different. And as I mentioned, I found less discussion of that within the Buddhist sources that I looked at, but it's quite possible that I've missed some. So I'm really interested in hearing more and hearing other people's views on the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to the next question. This one is for Adriana. Absorption might aim for liberation and to escape delusion, samsara, in some traditions. Have you seen examples of these ideas linked to absorption in modern postural yoga?
Was that question for me, Borayin?
Yes.
Can you please repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes, it's absorption might aim for liberation and to escape delusion, samsara, in some traditions. Have you seen examples of these ideas linked to absorption in modern postural yoga? Oh, I think.
Oh, she's here. You need to unmute, Adriana. There.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I tried to move, but my internet is just simply failing on me. So I didn't hear that question. Maybe just let's move on. I'm very sorry about that.
Right. Then there is one question that Theo has for our last presentation for Therese.
I have
right?
for Therese, yes. Therese, I really like the kind of breakdown you've given of the different curricula standards. I think it's really clear, but it's also really simple. So to dive a little bit into that, was it 12% or 16% on pedagogy? When you said that does include business, or it includes other things as well. In pedagogical terms, do you think that it is pedagogy as in theory and praxis, or is it pedagogy as in merely instruction, like how you get students to do what you want them to do? Because I think pedagogy and instruction theory are two different things.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's an interesting one. And I think that depends very much on the individual teacher training and the people conducting it. Because what I looked at really the structures given by those institutions in this part, and not at actual teacher trainings, because what is the problem? Yeah, exactly. What they make out of it is then again up to the teachers, and it depends. Like Beta Yoga, for example, they check on their teacher trainers a lot. Like they will check what they are doing. Yoga Alliance doesn't do that. So you can pretty much hand in anything, and as long as it fits their requirements, and then afterwards you pretty much teach whatever. So more or less, like, I mean, because nobody checks on you, nobody will double check it. So that question is not answered on this institutional level. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And it's what I suspected. I think, again, I've been saying for a while, I think the biggest issue for yoga teaching organizations of various kinds is accountability. We have no accountability at the moment in the system on a kind of general global scale. And how we square that and how we figure that out is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, and that would be like Germany would be an interesting context for that, because here they do have to be accountable of what they are teaching, actually. I mean, not all teacher trainings, but the teacher trainings that are part of those organizations. So it's quite interesting also their process of doing that. We can talk more about that when we meet.
Yeah, I just want to say as well, I'm struck once again by how important it is to pay attention to non-Anglophone contexts for our understanding of modern and contemporary yoga. I know Borayin completely agrees with me. We absolutely need more localization and more research that does that, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I think I want to offer a little bit of a comment for perhaps all the presentations, things that might be useful to think about as we can still see if we want to continue more. But I just want to offer 2 pointers, and this is something that you sort of mentioned here and there in your presentations, but that I see as flags that to look for, which would be several of you mentioned your question as a sort of as a diachronic process, right? So some questions were like, what is yoga, for instance? How do we define yoga? That's you started, Adriana, with that question, and then going back to the early definitions of the Katha Upanishad and so on and so forth, and then bringing that over to modern postural yoga. So how do we account for diachronic and synchronic contexts, which was something that was sort of a question mark I had for all of you. And so basically, what are we talking about? What are the definitions we are using for the phenomena that we are encountering? Are we sort of retro projecting our own ideas of what the Guru Shishya Parampara is or should be, or what yoga is or should be, and how it should be taught? Or what does it mean to silence the mind? Or what are these altered states of consciousness? If I think one thing yoga studies has shown you in the last few decades is that even within single traditions, there can be very different understandings about what these things are. The goals of yoga, what is yoga? I mean, we have Jim Mallinson here, who wrote that wonderful book with Mark Singleton, which is a source book to look at how incredibly rich something like the goals of yoga can be, samadhi, even within particular traditions, how that can be so very different. So what are we doing when we're sort of trying to project what we think is an altered state of consciousness or a silent mind onto the past? So just to try to be sort of a little bit cautious of that. And then another thing that I thought would be interesting for you, Martha, in particular, in looking at also philosophy of language would be interesting in your case. And there's a lot, of course, from different traditions that you know, could perhaps raise some interesting questions of how does that inner dialogue look like. Yeah, if you look at the different, for instance, the different levels of speech, right? And you know, someone like Bhartrihari, or you know, different the Shaiva levels of speech, and how do sort of modern practitioners refer to that or not? Is there sort of a reception of those theories and for example, witness consciousness and so on and so forth, as a difference between silencing and observing the chit chat, which is also something that you see in some pre-modern traditions. But basically, yeah, my main point was to cautious you to sort of project ideas either from the past to the present, or from the past from the present to the past, and see how the questions of diachronicity and synchronicity can you know, raise issues in research. That was my take for you, and I see it's 9:25. If you want to react and somebody else wants to add something, please. That was just a brief.
I have something to add that's probably complementary to that, Borayin, which is to offer one of the greatest pieces of advice I was given when I started significant amounts of kind of field work and contemporary research, and that was from the anthropologist Michael Hausman, and it's very, very simple. He says, follow what's weird. And I think it's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had for understanding cultural practice. Follow what's weird, because the things that don't make sense to you are going to be where the interesting stories are. Yeah, it served me well, and that speaks again to that diversity, I think, and to those assumptions that we make about a commonality of experience which might not actually be there in many ways. Nice. Have we blown our presenters' minds, or do they have anything to add? Martha.
Yeah, just respond to some of that. I mean, I think it's absolutely a valid point about not projecting ideas back, and it was a struggle that I had with this. Is like, well, what even is the language here? And obviously, you know, that those concepts are also mediated through the translations that I'm relying on. I have some Sanskrit, but I don't speak Pali at all, so I'm very reliant on that. So it's really easy to see problems with that. In a way, what I was trying to do is to find stuff that was suggestive of this being a valuable subject for future research, so I can kind of wriggle out of it a bit. So that's all I really needed to do, particularly from a cognitive science point of view. So I'm sort of interested in people picking it up from within that and seeing if that's something they can run with.
Nice. And are you reading your Lakoff and Johnson? If you're going to look at kind of semantics and language, you got to get to the. Yeah, you got to do some Lakoff and Johnson reading in there, I think. Nice. Borayin, are we about there? Do we think? How are we doing?
I think so. I think one of the things that I really liked about this session is that that there are a lot of potentials for the four of you to continue the conversation in terms of, you know, pedagogy and altered states of consciousness. So I think Marta and Adriana in particular could, you know, go into wonderful conversations regarding altered states of consciousness and the goal of silencing the mind, for instance, and Nikki and Therese regarding pedagogy and critical pedagogy and what that means for, you know, modern postural yoga and yoga beyond just the postural, and the relationship between the teacher and the disciple, and of course with Theo, you know, post-lineage yoga, where you don't necessarily have the guru in an individual form. So there are certainly conversations to be had, and I'm glad that we have this forum to continue those. So please feel free to reach out to each other. And yeah, thank you for your time. If anybody wants to say something in closing, otherwise, I would like to just say thank you. And I think, Theo, if I read you correctly, you want to say something?